You made the plan. You agreed to it. At the time, it felt fine. Maybe even like something you wanted. You said yes. You imagined it. You could see yourself there. And nothing about it felt wrong. Until later. As the day gets closer, something begins to shift. Not outside. Inside. You start thinking about it more. What it will be like. How long it might last. What kind of energy it will take to be there. How you'll have to show up. And slowly, what once felt simple, starts to feel heavier. Not overwhelming. Just, heavier. You don't cancel. You don't say no. But somewhere in the background, a quiet hope appears. That something happens. That plans change. That it gets postponed. That something comes up. And then, it does. The message arrives. Hey, can we reschedule? And immediately, before you even think about it, you feel it. Relief. Not disappointment. Not frustration. Relief. Like something invisible. Just lifted off your shoulders. For a moment, everything feels easier. Lighter. Simpler. And then, almost right after, another thought appears. Quiet. But impossible to ignore. Why do I feel like this? Because you said yes. Because at the time, you actually wanted to go. Nothing was wrong. Nothing bad happened. So why does not going feel better? And if this is a pattern you've noticed in yourself, you might recognize more of it than you expect. Take a moment. Listen slowly. Sometimes the things we feel relief from are the very things we once thought we wanted. There's a very specific way this usually begins. And most of the time, it doesn't feel like a problem. At least not at the beginning. Someone invites you to something. A dinner. Coffee after work. A casual meetup with friends. Maybe someone texts you. Hey, do you want to grab dinner this week? And in that moment, you say yes. Not reluctantly. Not forced. It actually feels natural. You imagine it quickly. The restaurant. The conversation. The familiar faces. And it seems fine. Maybe even good. So you agree. You add it to your week. And then, life continues. You go back to whatever you were doing. Work. Messages. Small routines of the day. For a while, you don't think much about it. The plan just exists in the background. Something scheduled. Something that will happen later. But then, a day passes. Then another. And suddenly, the day of the plan is closer. Maybe it's tomorrow. Maybe it's tonight. And that's when something subtle begins to change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Quietly. You remember the plan again. But this time, it doesn't feel the same. You start thinking about what it will actually require. Getting ready. Leaving the house. Driving there. Walking into the place. Finding the table. Greeting everyone. The conversation that will follow. Not just being there physically, but being there mentally. Emotionally. Responding. Engaging. And slowly, what once felt simple, starts to feel heavier. Not overwhelming. Just, less easy. You might notice it in small moments. You look at the clock. You think about what time you'll have to leave. You imagine the whole sequence. Getting dressed. Traffic. Arriving. Sitting there. Talking. Listening. And suddenly the plan feels more real. More detailed. Less abstract. And that's where something inside you starts to hesitate. You begin to imagine the interaction more clearly. The small talk. The energy you'll need. The attention you'll have to maintain. And this is where something shifts. You're no longer just thinking about going. You're thinking about how you'll have to show up. How you'll respond when someone asks how your week was. How you'll react if the conversation slows down. How you'll stay engaged. And that awareness adds weight to the plan. It's no longer just being there. It's participating. Maintaining presence. Staying involved. And that makes a difference. A subtle one. But enough. Enough for your body to notice it. Maybe you feel a small resistance. A quiet hesitation. You don't cancel. You don't send a message. You don't say anything to anyone. But internally, something is already pulling back. You might notice it in small ways. You delay getting ready. You scroll on your phone a little longer. You check the time again. You think, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I don't feel like going today. But it's not always just tiredness. Sometimes it's the feeling of entering something, stepping into a situation where something will be expected from you. Even if no one explicitly demands anything. The expectation still exists. To be present. To engage. To respond. To participate. And that expectation creates pressure. Not external pressure. No one is forcing you. No one is demanding performance. But internally, your system registers it. A sense that you'll have to sustain something. A certain level of energy. A certain way of being. And that's where the relief starts to make sense. Because when the plan gets cancelled, all of that disappears. Instantly. The need to prepare. The need to leave the house. The need to stay engaged. Gone. And what replaces it is space. You're back in your own environment. Your own rhythm. Your own pace. No expectations. No performance. No need to maintain conversation. And your body feels it immediately. A release. A quiet drop in tension you didn't even fully notice before. And that's why the relief feels so strong. Because it's not just about not going. It's about not having to step into that moment. Not having to carry that level of presence. And this pattern can appear even with people you genuinely like. Even in situations you usually enjoy. Because it's not always about the plan itself. It's about what the plan requires from you. You might truly enjoy those people. You might laugh once you're there. You might even think afterwards, that was actually nice. But before it happens, there's always that moment. That subtle shift. Where the plan stops feeling effortless, and starts feeling like something you need to manage. And that management adds weight. Even if the situation itself is light. And this is what makes it confusing. Because once you're there, sometimes everything is fine. Sometimes you enjoy it. Sometimes you even forget that earlier hesitation. But the resistance before it is still real. And the relief when it's cancelled is still real. And those two things don't seem to match. How can I enjoy something and still feel relief when it doesn't happen? And that question usually stays unanswered. So you explain it in simple ways. I was just tired. I needed rest. I wasn't really in the mood. And sometimes that explanation is true. But not always. Because the pattern keeps repeating. Even on days when you're not tired. Even when you have energy. Even when nothing is wrong. The same shift. The same resistance. The same quiet relief. And when it happens enough times, something begins to stand out. Not just a situation. But a pattern. Agreement. Time passes. The weight slowly increases. And when it disappears, relief arrives. And when you start noticing that sequence, something else begins to emerge. A question. Not about the plan. But about what your system feels. When it knows you'll have to show up. And that question is where the deeper part of this pattern begins. At some point, showing up stopped being just about being there. It started to mean something more. Something that required you to become a certain version of yourself. Not in a dramatic way. But in a subtle way that repeated itself again and again, until your system started responding to presence differently. Because there may have been a time when being present with other people was not simply about existing in the same space. It involved adjusting. Paying attention. Reading the room. You noticed small things. Someone's tone changing. A pause in a conversation. A moment where the atmosphere felt slightly tense. And even if no one asked you to do anything, you responded. You said something to keep the conversation moving. You softened your tone. You avoided saying something that might create friction. Sometimes without even thinking about it. You just felt it. That quiet sense that the moment needed something. And you adjusted. Maybe this happened at home. At the dinner table. In family conversations. Maybe it happened in friendships. Or in school. You noticed when someone seemed upset. You noticed when silence became uncomfortable. You noticed when things felt slightly off. And over time, being around people became something active. Not passive. You weren't just there. Your system stayed attentive. Present. Aware of shifts. Ready to respond. Ready to adjust. Ready to keep things smooth. And because you did this many times, it slowly became automatic. You didn't consciously think, I need to manage the interaction. But your system learned that presence involved participation. Not just talking. But monitoring. Responding. Maintaining connection. And when that pattern repeats enough times, something subtle changes. Presence starts to feel like responsibility. Not a visible responsibility. Not something anyone explicitly asks from you. But an internal one. A sense that when you are there, you are part of how the moment unfolds. Part of the emotional balance of the interaction. Part of keeping things comfortable. And that adds weight. Even in situations where nothing is actually required from you. Because your system doesn't wait to see if something happens. It prepares. It stays ready. Ready to notice. Ready to respond. Ready to adjust if necessary. And that readiness becomes a background state, not exhausting in a single moment. But over time, it accumulates. Like holding a muscle slightly tense for hours. Not painful. But not fully relaxed either. And this is where something important happens. Your system begins to associate presence with effort. Not visible effort. Internal effort. The effort of staying aware. Staying engaged. staying responsive. And when that becomes familiar, your system learns something else too. Relief happens when the interaction ends. When you're alone. When you close the door. When the house is quiet. When no one is expecting anything. That's when your system relaxes. Fully. No monitoring. No adjusting. No subtle responsibility. Just stillness. And over time, that contrast becomes very clear. Presence feels like activation. Being alone feels like release. So when a plan approaches, your system doesn't only think about the event. It anticipates the state you'll be in. A state of engagement. Of awareness. Of subtle responsibility. Even if the situation is friendly. Even if you like the people. Even if the plan itself is enjoyable. Your system still prepares for that state. And preparation requires energy. It activates something internally. Not dramatically. But enough for your body to feel it. That slight tightening. That quiet resistance. That feeling that something will be required from you. And this is where the shift begins. The plan stops being just a plan. It becomes an upcoming state. A state your system is already preparing for. And preparation always involves activation. So as the time approaches, you begin to feel it. That internal movement. That subtle pressure. Not overwhelming. Just enough to change how the situation feels. And this is why the relief makes sense. Because when the plan is cancelled, that state never happens. You don't have to activate. You don't have to engage. You don't have to step into that role. And your system recognizes that immediately. The preparation stops. The anticipation drops. The internal readiness disappears. And what replaces it is quiet. You stay where you are. In your own rhythm. In your own environment. No expectations. No monitoring. No adjusting. And your body feels the difference instantly. That drop in tension. That sense of space returning. And that is what creates the relief. Not avoiding people, but avoiding the internal state your system associates with being around them. A state that, at some point, required more from you than simply being present. And this doesn't mean something was wrong. It means your system adapted. It learned how to navigate interaction. How to maintain connection. How to keep things stable. Those adaptations helped you. They helped you understand others. Helped you respond to situations. Helped you stay connected. But now, they activate automatically. Even when they're not necessary. Even when the situation is safe. Even when nothing is required from you, your system still prepares the same way. Still anticipates the same level of engagement. Still activates that internal readiness. And this is why the pattern repeats. Not because you don't want to go. Not because you don't enjoy people. But because your system is responding to something deeper. Something learned. A way of relating to presence itself. And this is where many people misunderstand themselves. They think, I'm becoming antisocial. I don't enjoy people anymore. I just prefer being alone. And sometimes that explanation feels convincing. But it's not the full picture. Because the relief isn't coming from avoiding connection. It's coming from avoiding the internal state that connection activates. A state of awareness. Adjustment. Subtle responsibility. And once you begin to see that, something shifts. Because now the relief is no longer confusing. It has a structure. It has a reason. And that understanding opens space. Space to ask a different kind of question. Not about the plan. Not about the people. But about the state your system is preparing for. You might begin to notice, is this situation actually requiring that much from me? Or is my system preparing based on something it learned long ago? And that question changes how you experience the moment. Because now you're not just reacting to the feeling. You're observing it. Seeing it appear. Seeing it move. Seeing it soften. And that awareness creates the first real shift. Not in your behavior yet. But in your understanding. You begin to notice that the resistance is not always about the event itself. It's about the anticipation of a state that may not even be necessary. And that distinction matters, because it opens the possibility of experiencing things differently. Not by forcing yourself to go. Not by ignoring the feeling. But by understanding it clearly. Seeing where it comes from. And when that clarity begins to appear, something new slowly becomes possible. A different relationship with presence. Not as something you have to manage. But as something you can simply step into. And that's where the next part of this pattern begins to reveal itself. Once this pattern settles into your system, it doesn't stay limited to specific situations. It starts showing up everywhere. In small plans. In casual invitations. In things you even wanted to do. And the sequence becomes familiar. Almost predictable. You agree to something. It feels fine. Simple. Natural. And then, time passes. And something inside you begins to change. You might notice it the night before. You think about the plan. And instead of feeling anticipation, you feel something heavier. Not dread. Not anxiety. Just resistance. A quiet kind of resistance. You start imagining the situation more concretely. What time you'll have to leave. How long you'll be there. What the conversation might be like. Maybe it's dinner with friends. You picture the table. The restaurant noise. Everyone talking. Maybe it's meeting someone for coffee. You imagine sitting across from them. The conversation. The pauses. And suddenly, it doesn't feel like a simple plan anymore. It feels like something you have to enter. Something you have to sustain. And this is where the pattern becomes visible. Because the moment you imagine yourself inside the situation, you don't imagine just being there. You imagine maintaining the moment. Staying present. Keeping the conversation alive. Responding in the right way. Maintaining the energy. And that adds weight. Even before anything happens. You might notice small negotiations inside your mind. Maybe I'll go, but not stay long. Maybe I'll just show up quickly. Maybe I can leave early. You're already planning the exit. Before you even arrive. And that tells you something important. Your system isn't preparing to simply experience the moment. It's preparing to manage it. And management requires effort. Even when the effort is subtle. Even when it's automatic. And this doesn't only happen in social plans. It shows up in one-on-one situations too. You're meeting someone. Someone you like. Someone you feel comfortable with. And still, that same internal shift appears. You begin thinking about the interaction. What you'll talk about. How the conversation will flow. How you'll keep it alive. And again, you're not just imagining the moment. You're imagining your role inside it. And that role feels active. Not passive. You don't just show up. You participate. You respond. You carry part of the interaction. And that creates subtle pressure. Even if the other person expects nothing from you, your system still prepares as if something is required. And this becomes even more visible in group situations. You're with several people. Different personalities. Different energies. And your attention spreads across the room. You're aware of who is talking. Who is quiet. Where the conversation is going. And without thinking, you adjust. You speak when there's silence. You soften tension when the energy changes. You match the tone of the room. You keep things moving. And all of this happens automatically. So when the moment ends, you feel the shift. Not necessarily exhaustion. But a drop. A need to return to quiet. To not engage. To not respond. To not carry anything. And that contrast reinforces the pattern. Because being alone feels like relief. Not because you dislike people. But because nothing is required from you there. No monitoring. No adjusting. No subtle responsibility. And sometimes the pattern becomes most visible when something unexpected happens. A plan gets cancelled. And immediately, you feel that release. Not because the plan itself was bad, but because the state you were preparing for is no longer needed. The engagement disappears. The anticipation stops. And your system relaxes instantly. This pattern can even affect how you initiate plans. You hesitate. You delay sending the message. You think about it longer than necessary. Not because you don't want the interaction, but because you already anticipate the effort. The engagement. The state you'll have to enter. So instead of moving naturally toward it, you pause. You weigh it. You ask yourself, do I feel like this today? Do I have the energy for this? Is it worth it? And those questions are not really about the activity. They're about the state. The internal cost of being present in that moment. From the outside, this might look inconsistent. Sometimes you go. Sometimes you cancel. Sometimes you enjoy the interaction. Sometimes you feel resistance. But from the inside, it's consistent. The same pattern. The same anticipation. The same internal shift. And sometimes you even notice it while you're already there. You arrive. You sit down. At first it's easy. The conversation flows. Everything seems natural. But then, you become aware. Aware of yourself. Aware of the interaction. Aware of the need to stay engaged. And that awareness activates the same process. You start monitoring. Adjusting. Maintaining. You're present, but not fully relaxed. Not completely inside the moment. Because part of you is still managing it. And that's where the weight comes from. Not from the situation itself. But from the internal activity happening while you're there. Over time, this becomes your normal way of being present. Always slightly attentive. Always slightly adjusting. Always carrying a small part of the interaction. Even when nothing actually requires it. And because it becomes familiar, you stop noticing it. Until moments where none of that is necessary. Moments of complete stillness. No conversation. No expectation. No need to respond. And those moments feel different. Lighter. Simpler. Easier. And that contrast reinforces the pattern. Because now your system recognizes the difference clearly. This is what it feels like when nothing is required. And anything that requires engagement feels heavier in comparison. Even if the situation itself is objectively light. So the cycle continues. Plans feel fine. Time passes. Anticipation grows. Internal activation begins. Resistance appears. Relief when the plan disappears. And when this happens repeatedly, it starts to feel like part of who you are. I just prefer being alone. I don't really like going out that much. I get drained easily. And those explanations feel true. But they don't tell the whole story. Because the relief isn't really about avoiding people. It's about avoiding the internal state of constant engagement. And once you begin to see that, something subtle shifts. You start noticing the moment where the pattern begins. Not when the plan is cancelled, but earlier. When anticipation starts. When the internal activation begins. When the situation becomes something you feel you need to manage. And that awareness creates a small space. A pause. A moment where you can question what your system is preparing for. Not the plan itself. But the state your mind expects to enter. And that question is where the deeper part of this pattern begins to reveal itself. What you've been experiencing is not just about not feeling like going. There is a very specific logic behind it. Even if, until now, it felt random. From the outside, it looks simple. You make a plan. You say yes. And later, you don't feel like it anymore. That sounds like mood. Or inconsistency. Or maybe just low energy. But internally, something more structured is happening. Because the shift is not really about the plan itself. It's about what the plan represents. And to understand that, it helps to notice something subtle. The difference between presence and performance. At first, those two things seem identical. If you are present somewhere, you are simply there. But emotionally, those two states are not the same. Presence means existing in the moment. Performance means managing how you exist in that moment. And at some point, your system started connecting those two. Being present started to feel like performing. Not in a dramatic way. Not like standing on a stage. But in small, repeated ways. You had to notice the environment. Pay attention to tone. Adjust your responses. Stay engaged in the interaction. Maintain the flow of the moment. And because this happened many times, your system learned something. Presence requires management. So when you enter a situation, your system prepares for that role. The role of someone who stays aware. Someone who notices shifts. Someone who adjusts when needed. And this preparation happens automatically. You don't consciously decide to do it. Your system simply activates. It becomes attentive. Responsive. Ready to participate in shaping the interaction. And that internal activity requires energy. Not a huge amount. But enough. Enough that your system recognizes it. Enough that it prepares for it ahead of time. That's why the shift often happens before the event. You're not reacting to the dinner. Or the coffee. Or the conversation. You're reacting to the state you expect to enter. A state where you'll be slightly more aware. Slightly more engaged. Slightly more responsible for the interaction. And responsibility matters here. not external responsibility. No one is asking you to manage the moment. But internally, your system feels like you are part of how it unfolds. Part of keeping things comfortable. Part of maintaining connection. And that internal role creates weight. Even in situations that are objectively light. Even with people you enjoy. Because the weight isn't coming from them. It's coming from the role your system steps into. A role where you are subtly managing the experience. And once that role is activated, your system cannot fully relax. It stays engaged. Ready. Responsive. And over time, another association forms. Your system begins to link safety with preparation. Not relaxation. Preparation. Being ready. Being aware. Being able to adjust quickly. And preparation requires activation. It requires energy. So when a plan approaches, your system activates in advance. It prepares for the state. And that preparation feels like pressure. Not intense pressure. But enough to change how the situation feels. Enough to create resistance. Enough to make the plan feel heavier. And this is where the relief finally makes sense. Because when the plan is cancelled, the activation is no longer necessary. The preparation stops. The internal monitoring turns off. The role disappears. And what replaces it is stillness. A moment where nothing is required from you. No adjusting. No responding. No managing the interaction. And your system recognizes that immediately. It drops the activation. And that drop is what you experience as relief. Not because the plan was bad. But because the state associated with it is no longer needed. And that's why the feeling appears so quickly. Almost instantly. Because it's not a thought. It's a shift in your internal state. From activated to relaxed. And once you see this clearly, something important becomes visible. The difficulty is not the plan. The difficulty is the way your system relates to presence. It has learned to connect presence with performance. And performance with effort. And effort with something that needs to be managed. So the sequence becomes predictable. A plan appears. Your system anticipates performance. Activation begins. Resistance appears. Relief comes when the situation disappears. And this repeats again and again. Not because you don't enjoy things. Not because you dislike people. But because your system is responding to what it expects. Not necessarily to what will actually happen. And this is where many people misunderstand themselves. They think, I don't like going out anymore. I just prefer staying home. I get drained by people. And sometimes that explanation feels convincing. But it's not the whole story. Because what drains you is not always the interaction itself. It's the internal monitoring happening during it. The subtle adjustment. The constant awareness. The role your system steps into automatically. And once you recognize that, something shifts. Because now you can separate two things. The situation itself, and the state your system prepares for. You can begin asking, is this situation actually asking that much from me? Or, is my system preparing based on something it learned before? And that question creates space. A small but important space. Where you're no longer fully identified with the resistance. You can observe it. Notice it. Without immediately reacting to it. And that changes your relationship with the pattern. Because the resistance stops meaning, something is wrong with this plan. Instead it becomes, my system is preparing. Preparing based on something it learned a long time ago. And that distinction opens the possibility of something different. Not forcing yourself to go. Not ignoring how you feel. But understanding what the feeling represents. And from that understanding, a new way of being present slowly becomes possible. One where presence is not performance. Where you can simply exist in the moment, without managing it. At first that might feel unfamiliar. Even slightly uncomfortable. But over time, it can become something your system begins to recognize as safe. So maybe the relief you feel was never about the plan itself. Maybe it was about the state you no longer had to enter. Because there is a difference between not wanting something, and not wanting to become the version of yourself you think you need to be in that moment. And what you've been experiencing lies exactly there. Not in the situation. But in the version of yourself your system prepares to step into. A version that stays aware. That adjusts. That manages the interaction. Even if no one asked you to. Even if nothing actually requires it. Your system prepares anyway, because at some point, that way of being helped you. It helped you stay connected. It helped you navigate interactions. It helped you keep things stable. And now, it still runs automatically. Even when it's not necessary. Even when the moment could be simple. And that's why the relief feels so real. Because when something is cancelled, you don't just avoid the situation. You avoid the activation. The internal shift. The moment where your system prepares to step into that role. And your body recognizes that immediately. It lets go. It relaxes. And for a moment, everything feels easier. And then, the question appears. Why did I feel relief? Because part of you knows, you could have enjoyed it. You've enjoyed similar moments before. You've been there, and it was fine. Sometimes even good. So the relief doesn't seem to match reality. But it matches your anticipation. It matches the state your system was preparing for. And once you see that, something begins to shift. Not instantly. But subtly. You start noticing the moment before the resistance. The moment where the plan shifts, from something neutral, to something that suddenly feels heavier. You notice the thoughts. The preparation. The quiet expectation that you will have to manage something. And instead of immediately accepting that as truth, you pause. You question it. Not aggressively. Not forcing yourself to feel differently. Just noticing, is this actually required? Or is my system preparing automatically? And that small question creates space. A space where you're no longer completely inside the pattern. Where you can observe it. Feel it, without immediately following it. And that changes your relationship with the experience. Because now, the resistance doesn't define the situation. It becomes something you notice, not something you must obey. And from there, something new becomes possible. Not a dramatic change. Not instant comfort. But a slightly different way of entering moments. You may still feel the hesitation. That small internal weight. But you don't automatically assume it means something is wrong. You don't immediately step back. You allow yourself to move toward the situation, while holding that awareness. And when you arrive, something interesting often happens. You begin to notice that the moment itself is not as demanding as your system predicted, that you don't actually have to manage everything. That you can simply be present. Without constantly adjusting. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Even slightly uncomfortable. Because your system is used to being active. Used to monitoring. Used to staying ready. So relaxing inside the moment feels different. Almost like you're forgetting to do something. But over time, that unfamiliar feeling begins to change. Your system slowly learns something new. That presence does not always require performance. That you can be there, without carrying the entire interaction. That you can respond naturally, without managing every detail. And this learning does not happen through effort. It happens through experience. Through small moments where you stay, just a little more relaxed than before. Where you don't immediately step into that role. Where you allow the interaction to unfold, without trying to control it. And slowly, that changes how things feel. Not all at once. But enough. Enough for you to notice something subtle. This feels different. This feels lighter. And one day, almost without realizing it, you find yourself in a situation you once would have resisted. And instead of feeling that same weight, you feel something else. Not excitement. Not intensity. But ease. A quiet ease. The kind that doesn't require effort to maintain. The kind that doesn't need to be managed. And in that moment, you're not performing presence. You're simply there. And that changes everything. Not because the situation changed, but because your relationship with it did. Now you begin to see that the relief you once felt was never about avoiding something good. It was about avoiding a state that you no longer need in the same way. And that realization creates space. Space for a different kind of experience. One that is not based on constant engagement, but on allowing yourself to be present, without carrying more than what the moment actually requires. And that is something your system can learn. Slowly. Gradually. Without pressure. Without forcing. Just by experiencing things a little differently each time. And now, you're already moving in that direction. Even if it's subtle. Even if it's new. And that's enough. Because that's where everything begins to shift. From managing the moment, to finally being inside it.